financial crisis. He's a professor at Manchester Business School. Karel Williams is one. And just to make part of that dynamic duo, he's going to be joined by another gentleman who has published widely on contemporary capitalism, again in a wide range of academic journals and edited books, and he's also a regular contributor to the op-ed pages of Dutch newspapers and magazine. So he comes from the Amsterdam Metropolitan Institute for Development Studies, where he's a professor there of financial geography at the University of Amsterdam. Please welcome Professor Ewald Engelen. Now, so we've got Mr. Engelen, we've got the two of them here, our dynamic duo. I'm going to hand it over to you both and just put a little a new spin on this, and then we'll come back with everybody.
Hi. This moves things on a bit because we're going to talk not about what people should have seen before 2007. We're going to talk about what people have seen and the kind of stories people have told since 2007. And indeed, we're not actually explaining the crisis. We're explaining the paradoxical outcome of the crisis. And the paradox is big crisis, small reforms. Massive failure of regulation, and if you look at the Geithner or the British White Paper, entirely timid responses. The technical problems of actually getting something which works to produce safer banking are obviously considerable. But if you open the pages of the FT, you'll see columnists and others listing helpful measures. Capital adequacy, breaking up the banks, Tobin tax. We had several of those from Rasmussen this morning. And the question, of course, is why none of them are on the agenda, or anyway, none of them are on the agenda until all the advanced countries agree to do the same thing. And what we want to focus is on political resistance to reform around coming from the distributive coalition in finance. It's about the city and the UK, but it's got a much broader relevance. And this is really about how capitalism works, and also, in Dean's sense, about why journalism matters. Because, of course, capitalism runs on numbers, as you saw in Mark's presentation or Asker's presentation, but it also runs on stories which motivate political action and inaction. Good stories, bad stories. And a good story fits the evidence and gets the result politically, and a bad story is obviously dodgy and doesn't get the result. And the question then is, from this point of view of capitalism as storytelling, how did financial elites co-opt senior politicians? How did they get the politicians on side? And the answer to that, it seems to me, is the distributive coalition around finance. The lobbyists whom we heard about earlier essentially used a bad old story about the social value of finance to block reform. While on the other side, the journalists were broadly the good guys, but what they couldn't do was find a good new story. And one of the reasons for that was that the academics and the technocrats were disabled by knowledge failure. And there is, in a sense, a political message of hope, because the only way to fight a bad story is with a good story. And journalists and academics need to get their act together. So we're going to have a presentation in two halves. I'm going to talk about Scheherazade and the bad old story of social value of finance, blocking reform, and Ewald's going to talk about the honest struggle by the journalists, technocrats, and academics who couldn't find a good story. Now, let's come to Scheherazade, the 1001 Nights, of course, and you'll remember King Zaisar had an unfortunate experience in his first marriage because his wife was unfaithful to him. This was before the days of relationship counseling and analysis, so he decided to deal with the matter by remarrying and executing the wife after the first night. And this became a pattern of repeated behavior until, of course, Scheherazade came along. And it's a beautiful story in the 1001 Nights. You know, if it were Hollywood, she would be a plain girl with spectacles. But Scheherazade was gracious, and she was the daughter of the king's librarian, and she was enormously well-read as well. And what she did was, of course, each night she postponed her execution by telling a story which wasn't finished at dawn, so that King Zaisar wanted the next story. And in a way, this is what's happened to politics after Reagan and Thatcher. The middle-aged and elderly will remember corporatism, where you had organized labor, organized unions, and government as referee. We've now entered the Scheherazade phase, do-it-yourself representation by giant firms in loose distributive coalitions, telling stories to prevent re-regulation or get the results that they want. Today, we're going to talk about finance and the social value of finance. We could equally talk about the pharma industry and how it's based on R&D, or the idea, which is particularly endearing in Brussels, that diesel engines in motor cars are a clean form of propulsion. And the UK was a peculiar opportunity for the distributive coalition, because you had the Murdochization of the city. The city is not centre-right. It, like Murdoch, supports the guys who are going to win the next election and neutralizes them beforehand. And there's also a political appetite for stories of business success, because the pain of marketization has to be justified. And what happened at that point was that the city had a huge storytelling advantage after the crisis, because they could reuse an old story. They had a story about the social value of finance, about jobs created, tax paid, contributions to the balance of payment, which they'd been using in the 2000s. Indeed, in 2006, they were still at it in the Deloitte report about light touch regulation. They simply updated the old story and used it to deflect re-regulation. They had not only an old story which could be reused, they also had a chorus opportunity. The politicians had, before the crisis, commissioned reports not into the crisis, but into the competitiveness of the City of London. We heard about Boris Johnson, the Mayor of London. That leads to the Wigley report. Chancellor Darling commissioned the Bischoff report. And all these reports, their membership, their witnesses, and their drafting were dominated by finance. In the case of the Bischoff report, which was a Treasury white paper, 7 of the 8 members of the Secretariat were finance PRs. And what they did was they externalized dissent, so that, of course, what you have is Adair Turner and Mervyn King, and anybody else in late middle age who doesn't care about the next job that they have, being brave in public. But the reports are absolutely unanimous, a marked contrast with earlier reports like the Macmillan Report of 31 or the Wilson Committee in 1980, as Tony Jackson observes in today's FT. And the mechanisms then by which the story gets effective. The story is effective not because you believe it, not because I believe it, but because the senior politicians believe it. And the way you get that is buy in and copy out. Buy in, look at the forward to the Bischoff report, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer is there, going rabbit, rabbit, rabbit about how financial services are crucial to the UK's future. Then you have copy out. And at this point, it's very interesting to look at the July 2009 British White Paper, the key document, completely feeble. And you look at chapter 1 and you imagine, well, this will actually contain some kind of analysis of the causes of crisis, like the Adair Turner paper a few months ago. No. That's all it does is not review the causes of crisis, but copy out Bischoff's claims and evidence about the importance of financial services and markets to the UK economy. Once you've bought this story about social value and competitiveness problem, then, of course, it follows that finance should not be harmed by overregulation. And the end result is closure, which is rather different from capture in a public economic sense, because it's a socio-cultural process which works by framing problems and painting out radical policy options. And the social value of finance, it seems to me, is essentially what I would call, I talked earlier about good stories, bad stories. Here we have Orwell's good, bad story. Good because it's intelligible and actionable, so it does the job and gets the Mayor of London to Brussels. Bad because it selects and distorts evidence and is no sound basis for economic policy. And if you look at our alternative report on banking reform, Crescak UK, you'll see we deal with the main points. Huge tax revenues now offset by costs of bailout. The direct costs of bailout are larger than the tax payments of the whole of the financial sector for the past 5 years. Job creation, finance sector in the UK directly employs 1 million,